Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a really big one, a story that's just woven itself into the fabric of UFO lore and modern mystery, the Roswell Incident of 1947.
It's definitely one of the defining events. And, it's not just about asking, did aliens crash? It's about how this whole narrative got built, how the story shifted over time.
Right, and how maybe official secrecy or just, confusing signals played a role. We've got a load of source material here, articles, research, official documents, witness accounts gathered over decades.
A real mix. And our job today is to unpack all of that. We want to look at what actually happened in 47, what people claimed happened later, and how the government responded or maybe didn't respond effectively at first.
And we really want to focus on how this story became such an icon, specifically looking at the role of the ufology community, the researchers, the investigators who kept digging when everyone else had forgotten about it.
Exactly. They played a huge part in shaping the story we know today. So we'll look at the evidence, the competing narratives, see what holds up and what maybe doesn't. It's a story about a supposed crash, sure, but it's also deeply about belief, memory, and trust.
Okay, let's dive in. 1947. Where do we start?
We have to start with the atmosphere of the time. Summer 1947. You've got this remote stretch of New Mexico desert, but the whole country, really the world, was already buzzing.
Because of the flying saucers, right?
Precisely. Just a couple of weeks earlier, June 24th, this private pilot, Kenneth Arnold, he reported seeing these 9 really fast, unusual objects near Mount Rainier in Washington.
And he described their movement like saucers skipping on water.
Yeah, and the press just ran with it. Suddenly, flying saucers was the term on everyone's lips. It sparked this huge wave of sightings all over the place. People were looking up, wondering.
So the public imagination was already fired up about strange things in the sky.
Completely primed. Which is a really crucial context for what happened next near Roswell. It meant people were perhaps more ready to believe or at least consider something extraordinary.
Enter W.W. Mac Brazel.
Right, Mac Brazel. He was the foreman on the Foster Ranch, this big sheep ranch way out, maybe 75 miles northwest of Roswell town.
And he stumbles across something.
Yeah, sometime around mid-June, actually. So before the Kenneth Arnold sighting really blew up nationwide, he found this field just littered with, whoa, weird debris.
What kind of stuff?
According to his initial accounts, it was lightweight material. Things like strips of rubber, bits of tin foil, some kind of tough, papery substance, and these thin sticks or beams.
Not exactly spaceship parts, based on that description.
Not immediately, no. And apparently Brazel himself didn't think too much of it at first, just figured it was trash from maybe a weather balloon or something, just odd-looking trash. He kind of pushed it aside.
But then the flying saucer craze hits the news.
Exactly. By early July, you couldn't escape it. Brazel starts thinking back to that weird debris field. Could that have been one of these flying discs everyone's talking about?
So his curiosity gets the better of him.
Seems so. Around the 4th of July weekend, he goes back out there, this time with his wife and kids, and they gather up some of the material to get a better look.
Okay, so he's got this stuff. He's thinking maybe it's important. What's his next move?
He decides to take it into town. Probably July 5th or 6th. The dates are a little fuzzy. He drives into Roswell and goes straight to the sheriff, George Wilcox, shows him the material, tells him where he found it.
And Sheriff Wilcox takes it seriously.
Apparently, yes. He doesn't just dismiss it. He contacts the local military base, the Roswell Army Airfield, RAAF.
And RAAF wasn't just any old airbase.
No, definitely not. This was the home of the 509th Bombardment Group, the only group in the world at that time equipped with atomic bombs. It was a very high-security, strategically vital base.
So the fact that they got involved immediately over some weird debris is interesting.
It is. It signals that, at some level, the report was deemed worth investigating by a very serious military outfit.
Who did they send out from the base?
On July 7th, Major Jesse Marcel, who was the base intelligence officer, the S2 for the 509th, and another officer, Captain Sheridan Cabot from the Counterintelligence Corps, or CIC, they drove out to the ranch with Brazel.
To see the site for themselves and collect the material.
Right. They gathered up a significant amount of the debris. Marcel later described it, even initially, as something unlike anything he'd seen.
Then comes the bombshell, July 8th.
This is the moment that really sets Roswell apart. The public information officer at RAAF, Lieutenant Walter Hott, gets an order directly from the base commander, Colonel William Blanchard.
In order to do what?
Issue a press release. And not just any press release.
What did it say? I mean, the key part.
The key line, the one that went around the world, was crystal clear. It said, and I'm quoting here, The many rumors regarding the flying disc became a reality yesterday when the intelligence office of the 509th Bomb Group was fortunate enough to gain possession of a disc.
Wow, they actually said it. We have a flying disc. The U.S. military, the atomic bomb guys.
No ambiguity, no hedging. An official statement saying they'd recovered one of these things everyone was talking about, the effect was electric.
I bet. Headlines everywhere.
Instantaneously. Wire services picked it up, it went international. The local paper, the Roswell Daily Record, splashed that famous headline, RAAF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. For a few hours, it seemed like official confirmation.
The moment the world thought maybe we weren't alone, confirmed by the military.
Yeah.
But that didn't last long, did it?
Not even a full day. The reversal was incredibly swift, and that speed is just as crucial to the enduring mystery as the initial announcement.
What happened?
Later that same day, July 8th, Major Marcel flew some of the debris he'd collected from Roswell to 8th Air Force Headquarters over in Fort Worth, Texas.
And they had a different take on it there.
A completely different take. The commanding general there, Brigadier General Roger Ramey, called a press conference.
And he pours cold water on the whole thing.
Completely extinguishes the fire. Ramey announced that the whole flying disc thing was a mistake. What they actually recovered, he said, was just a standard weather balloon with a radar reflector attached. You know, the kind they used all the time.
And they had proof, or supposed proof.
They staged photos. Pictures were taken showing General Ramey, his chief of staff, Colonel Thomas Stubos, and even Major Marcel himself, kneeling over debris spread out on Ramey's office floor.
And what did that debris look like?
It looked, well, exactly like a crumpled weather balloon and one of those kite-like radar targets made of foil and sticks. Nothing like the flying disc from the morning headlines. They even brought in a weather officer from the Fort Worth base, Irving Newton, to officially identify it for the press as balloon debris.
So Marcel, the guy who brought the stuff in, is now posing with what looks like totally mundane material.
Right. Which, years later, becomes a huge point of contention for people who believe something was covered up. Was he playing along? Was the debris switched? We'll get into that.
So the official story flips 180 degrees in a matter of hours.
And then they made sure the news story stuck. The next day's Roswell Daily Record, July 9th, had headlines like, Jamarza Ramey empties Roswell saucer, and tellingly, harassed rancher, sorry he told about it.
Mac Brazel again. What did he say then?
The paper quoted Brazel again, describing the debris, rubber, foil, paper, tape, sticks. But interestingly, he apparently insisted even then that it wasn't like any weather balloon he'd ever seen before, and he'd found a couple. But he definitely expressed regret about all the attention. He just wanted to be left alone.
So even the original witness seemed unconvinced by the quick balloon explanation, at least in that moment.
That little detail often gets highlighted by researchers later on. Meanwhile, the official channels clamped down. Military records from the time, like the 509th's own historical report and an FBI teletype sent on July 8th, all reflect the official line. It was a radar-tracking weather balloon.
So that rapid sequence, incredible claim, swift denial, mundane explanation, photos of balloon bits, it worked, didn't it? At least initially.
It absolutely killed the mainstream media story. The flying saucer, captured by the Army, vanished as quickly as it appeared. Roswell faded from the headlines, became just another half-forgotten blip in that summer's saucer sightings.
But for anyone paying attention, or maybe anyone predisposed to suspicion, that whole sequence just screamed cover-up, didn't it? Why announce a disc if it wasn't? Why the rush to retract?
Exactly. It was clumsy. The atomic bomb unit doesn't just mistakenly identify a weather balloon as a flying disc and announce it to the world. That initial press release, followed by the hasty, somewhat awkward retraction, planted seeds of doubt. It created this vacuum of credibility that would fester for almost 30 years. The case was closed, but the questions were just lying dormant.
Waiting for someone to come along and start asking them again.
And that's exactly what happened. For nearly 3 decades, Roswell was basically a non-story. The weather balloon explanation, while maybe a bit odd given the initial fuss, was generally accepted or just ignored.
But then, the late 1970s roll around.
Yeah, and suddenly Roswell comes roaring back. This resurgence wasn't driven by new evidence suddenly appearing, but by the persistent efforts of civilian UFO researchers. People like Stanton Friedman, a nuclear physicist actually, who started digging into old cases.
They started tracking down the original participants, right? People who were there in 47.
Exactly. Friedman, in particular, decided to find Major Jesse Marcel, the intelligence officer who had handled the debris. And others followed suit, looking for anyone connected to the event. This renewed interest, these new interviews coming out, started putting pressure on the Air Force.
To the point where they had to officially look into it again.
Correct. By the early 1990s, partly prompted by inquiries from people like Congressman Stephen Schiff of New Mexico, the Air Force decided it needed to produce a definitive response to the growing controversy and the claims being made by the ufology community.
Which led to those two big Air Force reports in the mid-90s.
Right. The first one came out in 1994. It was called the Roswell Report, Fact versus Fiction in the New Mexico Desert.
Okay, fact versus fiction. What was their updated verdict on the 1947 debris? Did they stick with the weather balloon?
No, and this was a major, major shift. The 1994 report concluded definitively that the debris was not extraterrestrial. But, and this is the crucial part, they also admitted it was not a standard weather balloon like they claimed in 1947.
Whoa. So they admitted the original explanation, the one they pushed for decades, was wrong. Or a lie.
Essentially, yes. They said the 1947 retraction story wasn't the truth. The new official explanation was that the debris came from something called Project Mogul.
Project Mogul. Okay, what was that? Sounds classified.
It was, highly classified at the time. Project Mogul was a U.S. Army Air Forces program started right after World War II. The goal was pretty sophisticated. They were trying to use high-altitude balloons carrying sensitive microphones to listen for the sound waves generated by Soviet nuclear bomb tests, way up in the atmosphere.
So spy balloons, basically, trying to detect Soviet nukes.
That was the core idea, and these weren't just simple balloons. A Mogul array or train was complex. It involved multiple balloons, often made of neoprene rubber or early plastics like polyethylene, hoisting long lines with equipment. Critically, they also carried radar reflectors so the military could track them.
And these radar reflectors weren't just simple foil kites.
No, some were quite elaborate for the time. They needed to be lightweight but reflective. Descriptions mention reflectors made from things like foil-backed paper or plastic film, often reinforced with lightweight struts made of balsa wood or even plastic.
Okay, so how did the Air Force connect this Project Mogul stuff to what Mac Brazel found back in '47?
The 1994 report argued there was a strong correlation between the materials used in Project Mogul balloons and Brazel's original description of the debris. The rubber strips could be remnants of the neoprene balloons, the tin foil and tough paper, consistent with the foil-backed paper or plastic used in the radar targets, the sticks, likely the balsa wood or plastic reinforcing struts.
What about those weird markings? Brazel mentioned pape with flowers or letters, and later witnesses talked about hieroglyphs.
The report addressed that too, and it's quite interesting. They pointed to testimony from people involved in Mogul, like Professor Charles B. Moore, who worked on the project. He recalled that some of the reinforcing tape used on the radar reflectors tape, often sourced from toy companies or novelty manufacturers contracted to make these components, actually had decorative patterns printed on it, sometimes floral, sometimes geometric designs, often in a sort of pinkish purple color.
So tape with flowers or symbols could have literally been tape with flowers or symbols from a toy company.
That was the argument. These markings could easily have been misinterpreted, especially decades later, as something more mysterious like hieroglyphs. The report specifically suggested the Roswell debris likely came from Mogul Flight #4, launched from Alamogordo Army Airfield in New Mexico on June 4, 1947. It was tracked heading north towards the Corona area where Brazel's ranch was, and then contact was lost.
This is a big takeaway from the 1994 report.
Oh.
It wasn't aliens, it wasn't a weather balloon, it was a top-secret spy balloon project. And the 1947 weather balloon story was
a deliberate cover story. This was the bombshell admission. The Air Force stated explicitly that the weather balloon explanation was fabricated in 1947. Why? To protect the secrecy of Project Mogul. It was the dawn of the Cold War. Detecting Soviet atomic tests was incredibly sensitive, and they didn't want the Soviets or even the American public knowing about this surveillance capability.
And they argued that people like Major Marcel at Roswell wouldn't necessarily have known about Mogul.
Right. Due to the high classification and compartmentalization need to know. It was plausible, the report suggested, that personnel at RAAF might not have recognized the unusual Mogul components immediately, leading to the initial confusion and the flying disc report before the higher-ups clamped down with the weather balloon cover story.
Okay, that addresses the debris in a, well, complicated but terrestrial way. But by the 1990s, the Roswell story wasn't just about debris anymore. The alien bodies had become a huge part of it, thanks largely to the ufology researchers.
Absolutely central to the mythos by them. The 1994 report focused on the debris, but the body claims were hanging out there, fueling the narrative. So the Air Force followed up with a second report in 1997.
This one was called the Roswell Report. Case closed. Catchy title.
A bit provocative, perhaps. This report's specific goal was to tackle those persistent stories about recovered alien bodies.
And what was their explanation for those stories? How did they account for people claiming to have seen alien corpses?
Their conclusion was complex. They argued that the stories of alien bodies were not connected to the 1947 debris event at all. Instead, they proposed these accounts were the result of something called memory consolidation or time compression. Meaning that people's memories of the 1947 event had, over the decades, become mixed up or conflated with other separate experiences involving Air Force activities, primarily from the 1950s. Memories of later events got mistakenly attached to the earlier Roswell incident.
What kind of 1950s activities could possibly be mistaken for alien bodies?
The main explanation they offered involved anthropomorphic test dummies. Crash test dummies, basically.
Dummies.
Yeah. Starting in the early to mid-1950s, the Air Force was doing a lot of high-altitude parachute testing, dropping dummies from balloons and planes to study things like pilot ejection and survival. These dummies, sometimes called Sierra Sam or similar names, were designed to be human-like in size and weight.
Okay, but how does a dummy look like an alien?
Well, imagine finding one of these after a high-altitude drop or a failed test in a remote area. They could be damaged, dismember even. The report described them as having featureless faces, maybe latex skin, aluminum bones. They might have been wearing flight suits, sometimes appearing bandaged from instrumentation. The argument was that seeing such a figure, especially unexpectedly or partially obscured, could be unsettling, and years later misremembered as something non-human.
Dummies from the 50s. Was there another explanation offered?
Yes. The other possibility raised was that some body accounts might stem from people misremembering encounters with actual human victims of military accidents from the 1950s, things like crashes of experimental aircraft or even other balloon mishaps involving personnel. Seeing severely injured or deceased military personnel, perhaps burned or disfigured, would be a very traumatic and memorable event. The report suggested these graphic memories could, over time, become incorrectly associated with the 1947 Roswell story.
So the official narrative evolution is 1947, it's a weather balloon, which is a lie. 1994, it was actually a secret Project Mogul balloon, that's why we lied. 1997, oh, and the alien body stories. Those are probably just people confusing the 47 Mogul debris with unrelated crash test dummies or accident victims from the 1950s due to memory errors.
That's the trajectory, yes. And you can see why for many people, especially in the ufology community who had invested years in collecting witness testimonies pointing to aliens in 47, this shifting, multi-layered official explanation didn't exactly inspire confidence.
It sounds almost more complicated than just saying a UFO crashed.
For critics, each revision felt like another layer of obfuscation. Admitting the first story was a cover-up immediately damaged the credibility of any subsequent official account. It created an environment where even a detailed explanation like Project Mogul or a complex psychological one like memory consolidation could be dismissed as just another attempt to hide the real truth.
And the timeline issue with the dummies is a big sticking point, right? Widespread dummy use started years after 1947.
That's a major criticism. How could sightings of dummies in the mid-50s explain alleged body accounts connected specifically to the 1947 event, especially those that emerged before the dummy explanation was offered? The memory consolidation theory tries to bridge that gap, suggesting the memories blended later, but it's inherently difficult to prove or disprove for any specific individual's decades-old claim. It hinges on how you interpret the reliability and accuracy of long-term memory versus the possibility of it being reshaped over time.
Which brings us right back to those witness testimonies gathered by the ufology community. The stories that resurrected Roswell and built the extraterrestrial narrative. This is where the modern legend really took shape.
Absolutely. After lying dormant, Roswell exploded back into public consciousness because researchers sought out and published these accounts. And the central figure in that resurgence was Major Jesse Marcel Sr.
The intelligence officer from 47. The guy in the Ramy photos with the balloon bits, he dramatically changed his tune later on, didn't he?
Completely. Starting with that key interview with Stanton Friedman in 1978, and then in subsequent interviews, articles, and TV appearances, Marcel began claiming the weather balloon story was absolutely a cover-up, that he was forced to participate, and that the material he actually recovered from the ranch was, without doubt, not of this earth.
And his descriptions of the debris suddenly became much more Exotic.
Night and day compared to the 1947 accounts. Marcel, and later his son, Jesse Marcel Jr., who claimed he handled some of the debris as an 11-year-old boy back in 47, described materials with truly extraordinary properties.
Like the memory foil.
That's the most famous one. A thin, metallic, foil-like substance. Incredibly strong, but lightweight. Marcel Sr. claimed you could wad it up in your hand, and when you open your hand, it would just unfold itself perfectly smooth, with no creases or wrinkles, like it had memory. Other alleged witnesses later echoed descriptions of this unusual foil.
And the I-beams, the ones with symbols.
Yes, another key component of the later narrative. Marcel described small, very lightweight structural beams, sort of like tiny I-beams, made of a material that resembled balsa wood but was incredibly strong. And crucially, he said they had strange symbols etched or printed on their inner surfaces, purplish, hieroglyphic-like characters. His son, Jesse Jr., gave particularly vivid accounts of seeing these symbols. Some other later witnesses, like Altint Robert Shirky, also mentioned seeing beams with strange writing.
So how did Marcel reconcile these claims with the photos of him holding mundane balloon debris in Ramey's office?
This is where the debris switch theory comes in, a cornerstone of the cover-up narrative promoted by researchers. Marcel claimed the material shown in the Fort Worth press photos was not the real debris he brought from the ranch. He alleged that the truly unusual extraterrestrial material was swapped out, probably en route or at Fort Worth, and replaced with ordinary weather balloon parts specifically for the photo op to deceive the press and the public.
A convenient explanation. But is Marcel's later testimony considered reliable?
It's highly debated. Skeptics point to things like a comment noted in his military personnel file shortly after 1947, allegedly mentioning a tendency to exaggerate. More significantly, Captain Sheridan Cabot, the other officer who went with Marcel to the debris field in 47, gave interviews decades later consistently stating that the debris was not unusual at all, just pieces of balloon and reflector parts matching the official retraction story. Cabot directly contradicted Marcel's later sensational claims.
A direct contradiction from someone else who was there.
Yes. Plus, the fact that Marcel waited over 30 years to come forward with the alien story raises questions for some about memory accuracy, potential influence from the growing UFO lore over those decades, or maybe even embellishment.
What about Walter Haut, the public information officer who issued the original flying disc press release? His story changed too, didn't it, especially after he died?
Haut's account is another complex and controversial one. For years, decades really, he maintained he had limited involvement, just typed up and distributed the press release under Colonel Blanchard's orders, didn't see the debris himself, didn't know much more. He co-founded the UFO Museum in Roswell, became a respected figure in the community, but stuck to that story. His 1993 affidavit basically repeated this, though he added he felt Blanchard and Marcel were confident it wasn't a weather balloon. Still no claim of seeing anything himself.
But then came the posthumous affidavit in 2007.
Right. Released after his death in 2005, based on statements he allegedly made in 2002. This affidavit was explosive. It claimed Haut had seen much more. It described him viewing not only debris, but an actual craft, egg-shaped, metallic, about 12-15 feet long, inside a base hangar. And most dramatically, it claimed he saw bodies.
Bodies? What did it say about bodies?
The affidavit states he saw at least 2 small bodies, maybe the size of a 10-year-old child, with disproportionately large heads covered by a tarp in the hangar. It also stated the weather balloon story was definitely a cover-up conceived later, likely by General Ramey, and that Haut had attended a senior staff meeting where the real debris was discussed and even handled some of it.
That is a staggering difference from his decades of previous statements. How reliable is that affidavit?
Extremely controversial. The huge escalation in claims, the fact it was released posthumously and critically, the fact that it was reportedly composed by UFO researcher Don Schmitt based on conversations he said he had with Haut, not written in Haut's own hand, all these factors raise serious questions about its authenticity and accuracy for many investigators. His daughter confirmed Schmitt worked with him, but seemed unaware of the earlier, less dramatic 1993 affidavit. It's a very contested piece of the puzzle.
Okay, then there's Glenn Dennis, the mortician, another key witness promoted by researchers.
Yes. Glenn Dennis worked at the Ballard Funeral Home in Roswell in 1947. He came forward years later with claims that became central to the alien bodies narrative. He said he got strange calls from the mortuary officer at the RAF base inquiring about the availability of small, child-sized hermetically sealed caskets and asking about preserving bodies that had been exposed to the elements for some time.
And he claimed to have spoken to a nurse.
This was his most significant claim. He said a nurse he knew who worked at the RAAF hospital contacted him in distress. She allegedly described witnessing or participating in a preliminary autopsy on 3 unusual bodies recovered from a crash. Small bodies, large heads, large eyes, slit-like mouths, only 4 fingers, 2 of them badly mangled. Dennis also claimed he was later threatened by military police at the hospital when he tried to see or speak to this nurse again.
But his story ran into major credibility problems, even among the researchers who initially championed him.
It did. The biggest blow came when Dennis eventually admitted to researchers Kevin Randall and Don Schmidt that the name he had given them for the supposed nurse was phony. He'd made it up, claiming he needed to protect her real identity.
So the source for his most dramatic claim, the eyewitness nurse, was unverifiable and possibly fabricated.
Exactly. This led Randall, one of the leading Roswell researchers, to publicly state that Dennis was effectively impeached as a witness. His testimony, particularly the crucial nurse story, couldn't be verified and relied on an admitted deception. While some claim Dennis mentioned the casket calls earlier, the core of his sensational account became highly suspect.
So Marcel, Holt, Dennis, these are major figures whose later testimonies drive the ET narrative. But each comes with significant questions about consistency, timing, or credibility.
Precisely. And they are illustrative of the broader pool of witness accounts gathered by researchers, primarily from the late 70s onwards. You have this chorus of voices, dozens, even hundreds of people interviewed by researchers like Friedman, Randall, Schmidt, and others.
People claiming all sorts of things related to Roswell 47.
All sorts. People claiming they saw or handled the strange debris, like Loretta Proctor, Mac Brazel's neighbor, or his son, Bill Brazel. People claiming family members in the military told them secrets, like Sheriff Wilcox's granddaughter claiming he saw space beings and was threatened, or Sappho Henderson's family claiming her pilot husband flew wreckage in bodies. People claiming they guarded wreckage or bodies. Beverly Bean's father, PFC Elias Benjamin, who even claims seeing a live one. People claiming they heard threats, like Frank Joyce, a radio announcer.
It sounds like a wealth of testimonies supporting the crash story.
On the surface, yes, it creates a very detailed and compelling narrative. But the challenge from an investigative standpoint is the nature of this testimony. Almost all of it emerged decades after 1947. Much of it is secondhand, my father told me, or even thirdhand. Many are deathbed confessions relayed by relatives years later. Verifying these claims independently is often impossible.
And memory is tricky after 30, 40, 50 years. Plus, the Roswell story itself was becoming famous, which could influence recollections.
Absolutely. The risk of memory distortion, conflation with other events or stories heard over the years, suggestion, or even outright embellishment or fabrication is very high with testimony gathered so long after the fact, especially for such an extraordinary event. Rigorous vetting is crucial, and as we saw with Dennis, and even more so with others, that vetting sometimes revealed serious problems.
Though it's fair to say some testimony, even from the official side, seemed to support part of the cover-up idea.
Yes, that's important. Brigadier General Thomas Dubose, who was Colonel Dubose, General Ramey's chief of staff in Fort Worth in '47, the guy in the photos with Ramey and Marcel gave interviews and signed an affidavit later in life. He unequivocally confirmed that the weather balloon story was a cover-up. He said he was ordered by higher command, specifically mentioning General Clements McMullen from Washington, to ship some material up there and to put out the balloon story to get the press off our backs.
So he confirmed a cover-up, but not necessarily an alien cover-up.
Exactly. Dubose didn't claim it was aliens. He seemed to imply it was covering up something the military didn't want known, which aligns with the Project Mogul explanation. But his confirmation of a deliberate deception ordered from high levels certainly lent credence to the idea of a cover-up, which fueled the ET proponents' narrative.
And briefly, there were those claims about a second crash site.
Right, the stories about another craft crashing on the plains of San Agustin, west of Socorro. This involved different witnesses, most notably a man named Gerald Anderson, who claimed he was there as a child and saw the craft and bodies. However, Anderson was later largely discredited when it was discovered a diary entry he presented as proof had likely been falsified. That whole San Agustin angle is generally seen as much weaker, even within the ufology community.
So summing up this phase, the ufology community, led by persistent researchers, unearthed a vast amount of witness testimony decades after 1947. This testimony built the detailed narrative of an alien crash, bodies, and a cover-up that dominates popular culture today.
Their role was absolutely pivotal. Friedman, Randall, Schmidt, they transformed Roswell. They took fragmented accounts and wove them into a coherent, dramatic story. They challenged the official silence and then the official explanations. The Roswell story we discussed today is largely the story they constructed and promoted based on these later accounts.
But their methods and the reliability of some of their key witnesses have faced scrutiny, highlighting the difficulty of proving such extraordinary claims based almost entirely on decades old, often uncorroborated, and sometimes contradictory human memory.
That's the crux of it. It becomes a battle of narratives. The evolving official story versus the compelling, but often fragile, witness-based counter-narrative championed by the ufology community.
Okay, let's try to deconstruct the evidence itself. What actually holds up under scrutiny and what seems less solid, starting with the debris itself.
The debris is absolutely central, and the key thing here is the stark difference between the descriptions given in 1947 versus the descriptions that emerged after 1978.
Remind us of the 1947 descriptions again.
Mech Brazel's detailed account to the newspaper mentioned rubber strips, tinfoil, a tough paper-like substance, sticks, and tape with pinkish-purple flower-like symbols or letters. He insisted it wasn't a normal weather balloon. Major Marcel was initially quoted by the press, before the retraction, as saying it might be related to a weather device, mentioning foil and wooden beams. Critically, there was no mention in any 1947 account of materials with otherworldly properties.
Contrast that with the later claims.
Decades later, primarily from Marcel Sr. and Jr., and echoed by some other late emerging witnesses, you get descriptions of memory foil that smooths itself out, super strong yet feather-light I-beams with hieroglyphs, materials that couldn't be cut, dented, or burned, parchment-like substances, even thin fiber optic filaments. These are far more exotic claims.
Relying entirely on memory from 30-plus years earlier.
Exactly, and this is where the official Project Mogul explanation comes back in. The 1994 Air Force report argued that the materials used in Mogul balloons, the neoprene rubber, the foil-backed paper plastic, the balsa wood or plastic struts, the patterned reinforcing tape provide a very good terrestrial match for the specific mundane-sounding items described in 1947 by Brazel. Professor Moore, involved in Mogul, strongly supported this identification based on the descriptions and the likely flight path of Mogul #4.
What about the memory foil? That sounds harder to explain with mobile.
That's the trickiest one to align directly. While some later polyethylene balloon materials used by Mogul were quite resilient and might have seemed unusual, the truly self-restoring property Marcel described sounds like it could be exaggeration, misremembering, or perhaps conflation with other materials seen later. It doesn't clearly match known mobile components from 47.
So on the debris, the bottom line seems to be
Yeah.
the original 1947 descriptions align reasonably well with the declassified Project Mogul materials. The more extreme alien properties rely on much later, uncorroborated testimony and lack physical proof.
That's a fair summary of the evidence presented. Mogul offers a plausible, if initially secret, terrestrial explanation for what was found and described at the time. The later claims require accepting decades-old memories as perfectly accurate descriptions of truly anomalous materials, which is a much higher bar without physical evidence.
Okay, now the most sensational part. The alleged alien bodies.
Yes, the bodies. Here, the most critical point is their complete absence from the 1947 record. No mention in the press releases, no newspaper reports, no internal military documents like the FBI teletype, not even in Jesse Marcel's initial interviews in 1978 when he first claimed the debris was alien. The narrative of bodies recovered in 1947 seems to have emerged significantly later.
Primarily in the 1980s and onwards.
Mostly, yes. Driven by those testimonies we discussed, collected by researchers Glenn Dennis's story, Hott's posthumous affidavit, and numerous secondhand or deathbed accounts.
And we need to critically re-examine the credibility of those key body claimants.
Absolutely. Glenn Dennis. His core story relied on an admittedly phony nurse name, severely damaging his credibility. Walter Hott. His posthumous affidavit claiming to see bodies and a craft dramatically contradicted decades of his own prior statements, and its composition is questioned. Frank Kaufman. Initially presented by some researchers as a key insider witness with elaborate claims, but later exposed as a complete fabricator who created hoax documents now widely discredited even by former proponents like Kevin Randall. Jim Ragsdale claimed first-hand witnessing of a craft and bodies, but his story constantly changed, contained easily disproven details, faced allegations of payment for his story, and a formal statement, validity analysis, concluded it was likely fabricated or imagined.
So the primary sources for the body claims are riddled with serious credibility issues or rely on unverified secondhand accounts.
That's the assessment based on investigative findings. The other accounts are typically even further remove family members relating stories years later, etc., making them very difficult to use as solid evidence.
And the Air Force explanation for these stories.
The 1997 report, Memory Consolidation. The idea that these stories arose from misremembering or conflating the 47 debris event with later sightings of crash test dummies from the 1950s, which could look strange and damaged, or encounters with victims of actual military aircraft accidents from that later era.
With the acknowledged weakness that the dummy timeline doesn't perfectly match the earliest alleged 1947 body claims.
Right. The theory requires accepting that those specific 47 body claims are either misdated memories or composite memories formed over time. It's an attempt to explain the origin of the stories, but hard to prove definitively in individual cases.
So for the bodies, the conclusion seems even starker than for the debris. No contemporaneous evidence at all. Later claims are overwhelming secondhand or from witnesses with severe credibility problems. The alien bodies element appears to be a later addition to the Roswell legend, possibly influenced by other cultural factors or hoaxes, rather than something documented in 1947.
Based purely on the verifiable evidence from 1947 versus the nature of the later testimony, yes, that's where the analysis leads.
Let's look at the paper trail of the documents. We've touched on some, but let's recap their significance.
Okay. The RAAF press release, July 8th, 1947. Undisputed fact. A stunningly bold claim of capturing a flying disc. This remains the single most puzzling piece of contemporary evidence for those who believe something extraordinary happened. Why on earth issue it? That question fuels the whole mystery.
Then, the FBI teletype, same day, July 8th.
Also confirmed. It shows that internally, the military was already pushing the weather balloon with radar reflector explanation almost immediately. It reflects how quickly the official story was disseminated, at least within government channels. Declassified FBI files generally show they relied on the Air Force explanations and found no direct evidence of aliens in 1947.
The Ramey memo, the piece of paper General Ramey is holding in the photos.
This is highly contested. Some researchers claim that by digitally enhancing the photos, they can read phrases like victims of the wreck or references to a disc. However, the text is incredibly small, blurry, and obscured. Reliably deciphering it is extremely difficult, and interpretations are subjective and widely disputed. It's not considered solid evidence by most analysts.
The 1990s USAF reports.
Crucial. The 94 report introduces Project Mogul, argues the materials match the 47 descriptions, and importantly admits the 1947 weather balloon story was a cover-up for Mogul. The 97 report tackles bodies, proposing the dummy accident memory consolidation theory, but again, admitting the first lie significantly hurt the credibility of these later, more detailed explanations for many people. They saw it as proof of deception, not clarification.
And the Majestic 12 documents.
MJ-12. These alleged leaked documents detailing a super-secret government committee formed to handle the Roswell crash and alien technology. The FBI investigated and declared them completely bogus. The overwhelming consensus among document analysts and serious investigators is that they are elaborate hoaxes, likely created much later. They add a layer of deliberate disinformation to the mix.
So the documented paper trail offers a plausible terrestrial explanation, Mogul, for the debris. But the military's own handling of the situation in 47, the bizarre press release and retraction, the admitted cover-up, created this deep well of distrust that later official reports struggled to overcome.
Precisely. The mishandling of information in 1947 is almost as important as the event itself. It created the perfect environment for alternative theories, speculation, and the ufology community's narrative to flourish, making it very hard for even detailed declassifications decades later to gain universal acceptance among those already convinced of a deeper conspiracy.
And the reliance by some researchers on witnesses like Frank Kaufman or Jim Ragsdale, who were later exposed or heavily discredited, really highlights the pitfalls in this kind of investigation, doesn't it?
It's a cautionary tale. When building a case for something extraordinary, especially based on decades-old testimony, the credibility and verifiability of your sources are paramount. Relying on individuals later shown to be fabricators or highly unreliable severely weakens the overall evidentiary foundation of the claims they support. It underscores the absolute need for rigorous cross-checking and corroboration, which is incredibly difficult, if not impossible, for many of these Roswell claims.
So regardless of what actually fell on Mac Brazel's ranch, the story of Roswell took on a life of its own and had this massive lasting impact.
Phenomenal impact. Culturally, it's huge. The media played a massive role here. After that brief 1947 frenzy, they largely forgot about it for decades.
Until the researchers revived it in the late 70s.
Right. And then the media embraced the revived story, often focusing on the most sensational aspects promoted by the ufology community, the alien bodies, the cover-up, the exotic technology. Tabloids like the National Enquirer, TV shows like In Search Of, and later unsolved mysteries. Countless documentaries, books, movies, they amplified the extraterrestrial narrative, sometimes glossing over the evidential problems or contradictions.
They helped shape public perception and cemented Roswell as the UFO crash.
Absolutely. This sustained media attention, driven by the compelling narrative built by researchers, really became the engine of the modern myth-making process around Roswell.
And now Roswell is basically shorthand for UFOs, aliens, government secrecy.
It's the archetype, the touchstone case. It's often cited as the best evidence for an ET crash, regardless of the actual quality or reliability of that evidence we've discussed.
It fuels conspiracy theories like nothing else.
It's Exhibit A in the grand narrative of government cover-ups regarding extraterrestrial contact. The shifting official stories, the admitted initial lie, it perfectly fits the template for distrust, especially in a post-Watergate climate.
And it's leaked into pop culture everywhere.
Oh, completely. The imagery, the crashed saucer, the little gray aliens with big heads, the men in black, the secret hangar, reverse engineering alien tech. So much of that visual and narrative language in science fiction owes a debt to the Roswell story as it developed.
Even the town of Roswell itself has leaned into it.
Big time. The International UFO Museum, the annual UFO festival, it's become a major tourist draw, part of the town's identity and economy, which, creates its own dynamic and incentive to keep the mystery, particularly the ET version, alive and prominent.
And surveys consistently show a significant chunk of the public believes the ET crash cover-up story.
It has definitely captured the public imagination. It functions almost like a modern myth or folklore, tapping into deep-seated questions about our place in the universe, our relationship with technology, and our trust in authority. Its cultural power now exists almost independently of the specific facts of 1947.
So, despite the official reports declaring case closed, the enigma endures. Why can't we just settle it?
Well, at the heart of it, you still have that original baffling anomaly. The July 8th, 1947 RAAF press release saying they captured a flying disc. Why did they say that? If it was just a weather balloon, why the fuss? If it was even a secret Mogul balloon, why announce anything, let alone that? That initial inexplicable official act, followed by the clumsy retraction and the later admission of a cover-up for Mogul, creates this fundamental suspicion that's incredibly hard to erase. It's the anchor for belief in something more.
And then the stark conflict between the 1947 accounts and the later testimonies.
That huge divide. Was the truth suppressed in 47 and only emerged decades later through brave witnesses, as the ufology narrative holds? Or were the later accounts flawed by time, memory, suggestion, or fabrication, as skeptics in the official reports suggest? That fundamental disagreement over the reliability of human testimony versus contemporary records keeps the debate alive.
Plus, the definitive physical proof of aliens is still missing.
Crucially, yes, there is no verified, undisputed piece of extraterrestrial hardware from Roswell available for scientific study. The entire ET case rests almost exclusively on witness testimony, which, as we've seen, is fraught with challenges, especially when dealing with extraordinary claims made decades after the event.
Archival issues like missing records don't help either.
No, lost or destroyed records, even if routine, always fuel suspicion of a deliberate purge in a case like this. Redactions and release documents, vague language, it all allows room for interpretation and doubt.
Proponents argue, why would these witnesses lie? They faced ridicule.
That's a common argument for credibility. The counter is that human motivations are complex. People might misremember but be utterly convinced they're right. Some might seek attention or validation. Some might be genuinely confused or influenced by the powerful narrative that grew around them. And as we know from cases like Kaufman, some people unfortunately do fabricate things.
So the burden of proof remains a key issue.
From a scientific or rigorous investigative perspective, extraordinary claims like an alien spaceship crash require extraordinary proof. Decades-old, often contradictory testimony, lacking concrete physical evidence, generally doesn't meet that standard, however compelling the stories might sound.
It really seems like the military's own actions back in 1947, that bizarre sequence of claim, retraction, and admitted cover-up, created a credibility disaster, a vacuum that was then filled by decades of determined searching, storytelling, and speculation from the ufology community and the public.
It's the perfect storm, really. The initial government mishandling created the opening, public fascination with UFOs provided the fuel, and dedicated researchers provided the narrative structure based on later testimonies. Project Mogul remains the most evidence-based explanation for the debris described in 1947. But the sheer force of the competing narrative, the unanswered questions about 1947, the problematic witness accounts, and the lack of total closure mean Roswell persists as this captivating enigma.
So wrapping this up, we've traced the journey from that strange discovery in the New Mexico desert and that bewildering official reversal in 47
Yeah.
through the long silence to the dramatic revival driven by ufology researchers unearthing witness stories. We've seen the government respond with Cold War secrets to explain the debris and psychological theories for the bodies, yet fail to extinguish the powerful alien narrative built on those later, often controversial accounts.
And we've tried to separate the confirmed facts of 1947, the debris find, RAAF's involvement, that flying disc announcement, the swift retraction, the later admission of a cover-up for Project Mogul from the more speculative claims, the exotic debris properties, the alien bodies, the deep conspiracy which overwhelmingly emerged decades later, and rely heavily on testimony that faces significant challenges regarding verification and credibility.
Roswell's legacy, then, is maybe less about confirmed aliens and more about something else.
I think so. It's become this incredible case study. It shows how initial government secrecy, even if perhaps justified at the time by Cold War concerns, can backfire spectacularly. Combined with intense public curiosity, the tireless efforts of a community convinced of a hidden truth, the ufology researchers, and just the passage of time allowing memories to shift and stories to grow, a potentially explainable, if unusual, event can morph into this massive, enduring modern myth.
It highlights how stories evolve, how easily trust can be broken, and how a really compelling narrative can sometimes capture the imagination more powerfully than complex evidence, especially when the official story itself has holes or keeps changing.
It really makes you think about how we process information, especially about things that are mysterious or challenge our understanding of the world.
And maybe that leaves us with a final thought for you, the listener, to chew on. In this age of endless information, conflicting sources, and sophisticated narratives, how do we navigate it all? How do we weigh different kinds of evidence, official reports versus personal stories told years later? How do we decide what's credible, especially when dealing with a genuinely unknown or with institutions that haven't always been transparent? The Roswell enigma, maybe, isn't just about what happened in a desert 75 years ago. It's a reflection of our ongoing struggle to figure out what's real when the picture is messy and the stories keep changing. Something to consider.